good to see faces, similar faces again back here today. I see, in fact, I think, am I not mistaken? Is there anyone here today who hasn't been either in the Bible one or the Talmud one, just in terms of like recapping, or everyone's been? This is the point where sort of anyone, wait, you can all take off your, wait, let me just, here, I'll unmute all of you. You can just.
Hi, I haven't been here.
Who's this speaking?
I go by my middle name is Jake Shapiro.
Jake, wait, can I see you? Where are you, Jake?
Yeah.
Oh, hi, Jake. How's it going?
Good.
Great. Okay, so wait, you haven't been for the Bible and for the Talmud, or you were for one of them?
Neither.
Okay, great. Okay, so we'll do a little bit of a recap. So this is today. We're going to be discussing the third book out of the four that sort of the four books that changed Jewish history. The question that is lying in the back of our minds is, what does it mean to be Jewish, right? What does, if there's a God, what does God, he or she, want us to be doing? How have Jews throughout history interpreted what it means to be Jewish, and what does it mean for us today? So this lecture series looks at four books: the Bible, the Talmud, the Guide for the Perplexed, and the Zohar. Each which creates a revolution in Judaism where there is no going back after the book has been written. The Bible, as we discussed, it's very simple. It's the first book. If we like, the Bible is the sort of is what creates perhaps not a revolution in humanity, and this new idea, this ethical calling, right? We spoke about this idea of the chosen people, not necessarily meaning that we are the best, but that God has a project. God wants mankind to understand that everyone is equal, understanding the dignity of difference, understanding that we're equal despite the fact that we are different. We looked and touched upon different passages in the Bible to try and understand what is the sort of biblical project. In the Talmud, the second revolution, this already is an internal revolution because it doesn't really have any ramifications by and large on mankind, is all of a sudden a book that, right, if the Bible is the 5 books of Moses, and as we said last time, then we have the prophets, and the prophets then are the ones who are continuing the role of Moses and passing on God's Bible or the commandments. As we discussed, no one really listens to prophets, even though they're getting divine wisdom from God. And as a result, around 2,000 years ago, there is a new book called the Talmud, and this book essentially kills the prophets. And we have a new hero, a new character in Jewish history called the rabbi. And the Talmud is also a book which implements this idea of the question asking Jew, asking how. We delved into the texts that look about how no stone is left unturned, essentially in a book that is trying to explain, how do I practice being Jewish? We also touched upon some of the mystical undertones, right? We're talking about the fact that even though it's a legalistic book, its primary purpose is not only to bring forth the rabbi and give the rabbi the sort of social dominance as apart from the prophet or even the heavenly voices, but it's also a book that is explaining what it means to be Jewish. And interestingly, in this book, the rational and irrational, there's a new theme, a different idea, and we touched upon some passages. Today we reach Maimonides. Today we're talking about, we're in the 12th century. And what's interesting about this third book in the revolution, if I had to touch upon one incredible thing about this book, right? So according to Jewish tradition, the Bible is given to us by God. And like I said, for the sake of our talk, it doesn't matter if it was written by man, women, God. The tradition is God gave us the Bible. The Talmud, we then know, is an oral tradition, which at some point, perhaps out of fear of it being lost, is written down. And it's essentially, what is the Talmud? The Talmud is the minutes or the sort of protocol of all of the discussions in study halls taking place between 2,000 to 1,500 years ago, and that's the Talmud. So it also, in a sense, is not being written by one person. There was one person, Rabbi Judah, the president, who was the editor of the Talmud, but he didn't write the Talmud. The Talmud is the protocols of all the different study halls. And then comes Maimonides. 12th century, and this is incredible. This is the first time we have a book that everyone agrees is written by one person. In fact, we actually have in manuscript an autograph. We actually have a book that Maimonides wrote and ends it by saying, I wrote this book. So we know Maimonides wrote the book. Maimonides wrote other books as well. He's the first one to try and take the Talmud and say, not every Jew can read the Talmud. The Talmud is full of, as we saw, complicated discussions. And so Maimonides, one of his main projects is the Mishneh Torah. The Mishneh Torah is, let's simplify for every Jew how to practice Judaism. And he gives us a list of 613 commandments, and he gives us also a philosophical rationale for what these mean. This isn't part of this talk, but about 100 years after Maimonides, perhaps the greatest Kabbalist who ever lived, Nachmanides, will say he doesn't agree with Maimonides' list, and he'll change it a little bit, and it has ramifications for the Zionist project, believe it or not. We can touch upon that later. So anyway, Maimonides writes a whole lot of stuff. He wrote a sex guide for the Sultan of Egypt. He writes this practical book for how Jews should be Jewish, and he writes the guide for the perplexed. The reason we are focusing on the guide for the perplexed is because this is the book which changes God. The God that is introduced in the guide for the perplexed, and when I say God, we are going to see it has massive ramifications because it's not only God, but it's what are angels in the Bible? What is the God of the Bible? And then what is the purpose of being Jewish? Everything changes after the guide for the perplexed. Jewish books after the guide for the perplexed will agree with Maimonides. They will disagree with him, but almost no one will not cite him. And that's incredible. Once Maimonides writes his book, that's it. Everyone is going to talk about the Bible, the Talmud, and the guide for the perplexed. So what we're going to do this time is we're going to try and understand what is this book that for the first time since the Bible, something which even the Talmud didn't do, turns Judaism upside down. I'm going to give a little bit of a background, just sort of to understand where this is coming from, and then we're going to head right into the text. Okay, so Maimonides living 12th century. What's Maimonides' problem? Maimonides' problem, as we're going to see, you know what? No, let's start by what we did with the Bible and the Talmud. Let's look at the first paragraph of the book, right? We walk into Barnes and Nobles, walk into, Amazon. Let's read the first paragraph. I must admit this paragraph is a little more technical, a little more difficult. Some of you might also not like it, and I'd love to hear why not. Let's read it and try and understand why Maimonides writes the book that he writes. Okay, so do I have any buyers? Does anyone want to read slowly? And feel free, whoever chooses to read this paragraph, take a few lines, stop, let's talk about it and continue. Like I said, we're getting into philosophy here, so, let's not, this isn't a story. Who wants to start? Yeah, Guy, go for it.
The first purpose of this treatise is to explain the meaning of certain terms occurring in books of prophecy. Some of these terms are equivocal, hence the ignorant attribute to them only one or some of the meanings in which the term in question is used. Others are derivative terms, hence they attribute to them only the original meaning from which the other meaning is derived. Others are amphibulous terms, so that at times they are believed to be univocal and at other times equivocal. It is not the purpose of this treatise to make it totality understandable to the vulgar or to the beginners in speculation, nor to teach those who have not engaged in any study other than the science of the law. I mean the legalistic study of the law.
Let's stop here for a moment. Who is Maimonides writing for?
For the rabbis.
For the rabbis. Okay, so sort of the leaders of the community, perhaps. Okay.
Is he writing for the uneducated Jew or the mildly educated Jew?
For the mildly educated Jew.
Obviously it's really difficult to understand what he's writing, but he's talking about people who aren't really studied in the texts.
Where does it say that he's writing for people that don't fully understand?
Maybe he's writing about them more than writing for them.
Okay, yes, okay. That I think is more spot on with what we've read thus far, meaning Maimonides has a problem. He has a problem with a mass of people, according to this beginning of the paragraph, right? Maimonides goes to synagogue in Cairo where he writes this book, and people are talking about, the Bible says that God has a hand, and this hand took the Jewish people out of Egypt. Did God really take the Jewish people out of Egypt with a stretched out hand? There's a book where we talk about Abraham. We'll touch upon this, where angels come to Abraham. Did angels really come to Abraham? What did Abraham really see? Now, brackets, a little background. Greek philosophers, Plato, Aristotle, right? Alexander, the Mu'tazila, the Kalam. What's going on here? Around the time of the Talmud, plus minus, right? We have Greek philosophers who are revolutionizing, they are creating Western culture. And these texts, which are written in Greek, are very quickly translated in the sort of a golden era of Islam into Arabic. And then Maimonides gets these texts. Maimonides, now he's less into Plato. We're not going to really get into this, but essentially, if we have two sort of giants, I'm going to put Pythagoras aside, and he'll forgive me. But let's say we take Aristotle and Plato. One of the main differences between these two great philosophers is that Aristotle is sort of more of our scientist, and Plato is more of our sort of mystic, if we could sort of put it like this, okay? And it's not entirely fair, but it's also, some would say it's also fair to put it like this. As we will see, Maimonides is less into Plato, he's more into Aristotle, and he's reading these books, he's reading philosophy, and he's doing something that hasn't been done before. He wants to get into a dialogue with these philosophers, look back at the Bible, and say, what are we really reading here? Let's continue.
For the purpose of this treatise, and of all those like it, it is the science of the law in its true sense. Or rather, its purpose is to give indications to a religious man for whom the validity of our law has become established in his soul and has become actual in his belief. Such a man being perfect in his religion and character, and having studied the science of philosophers and come to know what they signify. The human intellect.
Yeah.
Okay, carry on.
So who again? He's talking here about such a man being perfect in his religion and character. Again, who is this book for? Any thoughts?
Other philosophers.
The philosophers. Well, okay. We're getting close. We're getting close. Any other thoughts? Let's keep on. Let's keep on.
Okay. Signify, right?
Yeah.
The human intellect have drawn him in on and led him to dwell within its province. He must have felt distressed by the externals of the law and by the meanings of the above-mentioned equivocal, derivative, or amphibolious terms. As he continues to understand them by himself, or was made to understand them by others. Hence he would remain in a state of perplexity and confusion as to whether he should follow his intellect, renounce what he knew concerning the terms in question, and consequently consider that he has renounced the foundations of the law.
Now he has finally told us who exactly this is for. There are people in the Jewish community, only specific people who have a problem. What is their problem? They've been reading two books, right? There are Jews, not many, who have read the Bible, and up until Greek philosophy comes about, I can read mythology, I can read about a god, an outstretched hand, I can read about angels, and I have no problem with that. And as we saw in the Talmud, there is no problem with that. But then Greek philosophy comes about, Aristotle comes about, and talks about, well, there isn't really a god that watches over the world. That surely doesn't logically make sense. And they do this through, different refutations and different logical proof. And essentially, if we take, right, what is the Aristotelian God? The Aristotelian God, albeit, is a God in the sense that there was a big bang, there was something at the beginning that made this world, that created this world. But to Aristotle, it's clearly not someone with a beard and not someone who's loving and not someone who's watching over. It is some larger than life force that did like this, and presto. And Maimonides reads this logic, a lot of it makes a lot of sense. And there is a person in the Jewish community who is in a state of perplexity. On the one hand, reading certain terms in the Bible that are equivocal or unequivocal, they can mean certain things, right? God's outstretched hand or an angel. What exactly does it mean? They've also read in Arabic the philosophical texts of Aristotle, Plato, and others, and they're perplexed. They're embarrassed. They're not sure if what there is a danger here. There is a danger that certain people, there are two dangers here. Maimonides is, one danger is for the people, simple people, perhaps, and we're going to see the Guide for the Perplexed is a little bit of an elitist book. There is no other way of looking about this, make no mistake, right? They're talking about people who are vulgar or beginners in speculation. This isn't for them. But they also have a problem. Maimonides has a problem with the mass that actually believe God has a stretched out hand and they're real angels. But he also has a problem, and this is perhaps his primary audience, and we'll see more of this as we go along, with people who have been learning science. They've got a college degree in the 12th century. They know their Bible. They want to be the best people they can be, and they're perplexed. How does Aristotle and Bible go together? That is the project of the Guide for the Perplexed. And that, in that sense, what Maimonides is doing is there's no going back after this, because there's been this philosophical discussion for over 1,000 years, and he sees what's happening, and something has to be done. And this is the book he writes. Before I ask if anyone has any questions, as we're perhaps going to see, once this book is published, many Jews burn this book. This book is banned. This book is burned. There are many Jews that have a problem with this book because it changes everything. Do we have any questions about the first paragraph?
Yeah, I would like to ask.
Yep.
Was it kind of also reaction to the Islamic rule, which kind of was very inspired by these Greek philosophers, and that the Jewish people in that time were kind of losing on the progress, so they were ideologically not that developed?
100%, 100%. As I mentioned, the first to translate these texts, right, from Greek is into Arabic, and Maimonides is living in part of the Muslim empire, Islamic empire, and yes, they are all Islam. There is a lot of, there are part of the philosophers that Maimonides talks about, Al-Farabi, Al-Ghazali, are the sort of Averroes. They are the kind of, it's the Muslim philosophers that become the texts that are translated even into Hebrew. Meaning the Hebrew translations that we have of the first Greek philosophical texts are not from the original. They're from the Arabic translations. And in that sense, yes, without a doubt, Maimonides is reading this. Everyone else in the Islamic world is reading this, and the Jews are not yet reading it. And those who are reading it don't yet have that sort of Jewish voice to come and say, let's explain what's going on here. So there's a lot of embarrassment, there's a lot of awkwardness, and not really sure, what do we do with this book and what do we do with this book? Great question. Anyone else? Okay. So how would you guess, what do you think this book is going to be about? If the Bible is about, right, the sort of story of the Jewish people, and the Talmud is about how to be Jewish, based on this, the sort of first paragraph, what are we going to see in the Guide for the Perplexed? What are the sort of table of contents going to look like? Any thoughts?
The table of contents of this book.
Yep. What are the main issues that Maimonides is gonna be doing, gonna be discussing?
Sounds like one of them is terms, just kind of a glossary a little bit, but I wouldn't expect it to be very succinct.
Okay, so firstly, that's a great guess, because that's the start of the book. It's not that the start of the book really is taking terms like the word place, makom, regel, foot, Maimonides chooses, and there's a huge debate. Again, something else just in brackets we need to understand about Maimonides. Until this very day, scholars argue about what Maimonides really believed. And there's like a joke that everyone has their own Maimonides. The sort of Kabbalistic scholars will say, well, of course, Maimonides believed in mysticism, and they'll find you a passage where, one could suggest that. And philosophers will say, well, of course not, and so on and so forth. And in fact, even in his introduction, Maimonides says, there are many times where you are going to find contradictions in my book. You're going to read one chapter and you're going to say, this is God. You're going to read another chapter and say, oh, this is God. And he writes in his introduction, the contradictions are on purpose because I only want the best of the best to understand what I have to do, what I have to say. And here's just another note before I continue on what you said, Alison. Maimonides has one more problem. His problem is, and this is educationally, this is what makes the Guide for the Perplexed a masterpiece. Okay, so follow. He wants to be able to give us the secret, quote unquote, right? He's saying the Bible has a secret inside it. The oral tradition that we spoke about in the Talmud, there is a secret. There is something that has really only been passed on by word of mouth. The elitists get it. I know that if I don't write it down, it's going to be lost. However, if I write the secret openly, everyone can read it and many are going to misunderstand. So he perpetrates a book that has locked, it's like every chapter has a seal. He's done this in such a methodology that there are contradictions. He scrambled in Arabic the word, what? Come again? Did someone want to say something?
Sorry.
Okay, there's an expression in Arabic, tabdid al-alm. Tabdid al-alm means spreading the knowledge. What does this mean? An esoteric style of writing, if you want to hide a secret from a simpleton, is you're going to write a bit about it on the first page and more about it on the 250th page. And that way he's not going to reach the 250th page, but if he does, he'll suddenly understand the puzzle he had on the first page. So Maimonides is using all these different esoteric styles to create a book that on the one hand has everything, and yet only those who really have read science, have read philosophy, have read through it a million times, can sort of slowly try and decipher the secrets. In that sense, educationally, it's an incredible, perfect book. So to go back to Alison, what you said, yes. Now the reason I said this is because the first part is about terms, but we're not sure why Maimonides chose the structure he chose. It's very bizarre. He starts with terms, a few chapters talking about, like I said, what the word place means, what the word foot means, and he chooses some of them. And even the first sentence of each passage, of each term, has a different beginning. And scholars have written articles upon articles to explain why each chapter starts with different sentences. They say, do you want to find a book that is written by man that you could argue about every single word? It's the Guide for the Perplexed, regardless of if you're Jewish or not Jewish. By the way, one thing, anyone who wants to read this book, I highly recommend the English translation of what's his name? Shlomo Pines. Shlomo Pines, who dedicated his life to sort of, researching philosophy, but especially Maimonides, wrote a brilliant translation. It was published by Chicago University Press with an introduction by Leo Strauss. I think it's considered to be the best translation in English. It really is translated by an expert who has not only understands the Arabic it was written in, but also the Hebrew and has the English to be able to perpetrate such a translation. So it's about a lot of things. It's about what is God? It's about what is the purpose of the commandments? And some of the questions, right, like we spoke about the chosen people, are going to become very dramatic and very interesting and perhaps not even touched upon by Maimonides. And we're going to try and understand what we think he thinks about these things. So let's start with our new God according to Maimonides. Who would like to read?
Okay, so
Yes, who volunteered? Who was that?
May.
Yes, Jaime. Go for it.
It follows necessarily from the 25th premise that there is a mover which has moved the matter of that which is subject to generation and corruption, so that it receive form.
Okay, stop here for a moment. You'll notice at the bottom, this is from the guide for the Perplexed has 3 sections. This is the start of the second section. The end of the first section had a whole bunch of assumptions, hypotheses made by Greek and Islamic philosophers. And now it's Maimonides' turn to say, and this is God, okay? One more thing. The first sentence you just read, what is being described here? What is being described here?
Something
Creation of the world.
Close. I mean, yeah, essentially, yes, but if we're talking about creation, then who are we talking about? God. Have you ever read a more bureaucratically dry sentence of the so-called biblical God? Like, what is going on here?
I feel like before with the Bible and the Talmud, God had this very poetic language with how people refer to God, and almost like a father and like a caring way. But this is like very, like you said, like more of like the scientific way of explaining God. So, or
Exactly.
like
What is he called? He's called a mover, right?
Yeah, like
mover.
a matter, like physics. Like
Exactly. This is Maimonides, who has read Aristotle's book on physics. He's read it all. He's read every single scientific book that he can get his hands on, be it about magic, be it about philosophy. And he's now going to try and explain through the sort of the prism of science, what is the God we're talking about in the Bible, right? So the 25th premise is you know, that the philosophical discussion, Maimonides in the guide will bring other philosophers, he'll bring other books, he'll say, well, this is what they say, and then this is what I say. So what we see here, yeah, sorry?
No, I'm listening.
Oh, so, right, so this is where we are now. He's finished with what they've said, and now we're going to talk about this mover, because this is the language in which the philosophical books are being written, and so this is how he's talking about it in this section. Now, when it says here generation and corruption, I don't know if you know, but philosophically, generation means anything that is created, and corruption is anything that's been destroyed, right? That's like the cycle of life, birth and death, generation and corruption. And then in philosophy, we have, and again, this isn't a talk about philosophy, but we have 2 main things that allow anything to exist: form and matter, right? Matter is like the DNA, and form is what gives it shape. Philosophers, according to philosophy, unlike Kabbalists, you can't have form without matter, that they have to both come together. The only exception is Heilig matter. Heilig matter is the sort of this beginning matter that sort of, you know, is the beginning, you know, what sort of this bang that then God brings about the world, or the sort of quote unquote scientific God. If there any questions, if not, then May please continue. Anyone have any questions?
No.
I have a.
Yep.
Can you explain the concept of corruption? I didn't understand well.
Yeah. So okay. So he talks about there being a mover. The mover which moved the matter. Okay. So there is matter. There is Heilig matter. There is this initial beginning something, this goo, right? This plasma. And this plasma is susceptible, right? It's the first thing that has the potential to create something which will live and something which will perish. Okay, in essence, it's the beginning matter, which is the sort of DNA of what life is all about. Okay, so the sort of this Heilig matter, which is the circle of life matter, which has the subject to generation and corruption, is a way of saying, if you like, we could write it in simple language, saying when God first moved the initial point of something. Okay, the sort of Big Bang, this sort of like this. That's, you know, and again, it's just because it's philosophical terms, and I brought purposely exactly what the translation was to understand that. Imagine we're a Jew who only knows the Bible and only knows the Talmud, and we haven't read any science, we haven't gone to school other than what we learned with our rabbis. You don't have a hope in understanding what this is about. If you haven't read Aristotle, if you haven't read Plato in Arabic, there is no chance of understanding what, right? Understand this. If someone picks up this book, it was written in Arabic, and Jews wrote in or sort of Hebrew letters, but in Arabic. So any Jew could pick up this book and read it, but you see this, you have no idea what's going on. And I think that's part of the point. Maimonides wants a specific audience, an elitist audience, to be reading this book. Hopefully then they will be able to explain to the masses, you know, how to really understand the Bible. And then that's the ripple effect. So let's continue.
If now it is asked, what moved this proximate mover? It follows of necessity that there exists for it another mover, either it is own species or for a different species. It is as if you say this stone, which was in motion, was moved by a staff, the staff was moved by a hand, the hand by tendons, the tendons by muscles, the muscles by nerves, the nerves by natural heat, the natural heat by the form that subsists therein, this form being undoubtedly the first mover.
Right? So God is this first mover, which is our new God, and he's using a very full, by the way, the example he brings, this appears in Aristotle in the book on physics. You know, this is now we're going into, rabbis don't talk like this, right? This is the first time that a rabbi, Maimonides was a rabbi, starts talking like a philosopher. And the rest is history. So this is our new God. Okay, now, can you imagine with this new God, what are the angels in the Bible? What are the prophets hearing? What happened in Mount Sinai? What does it mean to be Jewish? Right? What do you think it means to be Jewish according to Maimonides based on this God?
So my understanding, and please correct me if I'm wrong, is that all of like the angels and what the prophets are hearing and everything else is just an extension of God.
Which is what?
The natural heat or whatever, the equivalent of.
Okay. In the next passage we'll read it, things will become more clear. I'm trying to see if sort of we have an assumption yet of kind of, you know, sort of where Maimonides is heading. Any other thoughts?
I think he's more like even questioning the form of dialogue the prophets were saying, as not if that's not some kind of higher knowledge which is contained among the culture itself, and if he is not interpreting the divine through obtaining this knowledge, I would think.
Okay. So let's now take these two thoughts, what you just said, Michael and Guy, and let's move on now. Anyone else want to ask a question or add? Okay. We're going to now read what Abraham saw, and we're going to discuss prophecy, right? Because this is exactly what we're talking about. This is the next link, which will help us then to understand what is the purpose of being Jewish. So this is our God. It's still not enough. And again, I've brought a tiny passage. Let's start with, right, so this is Genesis. I'll read this quickly. This is the Bible. Before Maimonides, let's just recap what happened in the Bible. So Hashem, right, God. Hashem, for those who don't know, literally means the name. One of God's names in the Bible is the name. The idea being he is the sort of all-encompassing name. You know, this goes back to the idea of power of words. So Hashem, the name, appeared to him in the plains of Mamre. He appears to Abraham while he was sitting at the entrance of the tent. This is just after he circumcised himself at the age of 99, in the heat of the day. He lifts his eyes and saw, and behold, 3 men were standing by him. He saw them, so he ran toward them, from the entrance of the tent and bowed toward the ground. And he said, "My lords, if I find favor in your eyes, please pass not away from your servant. Let some water be brought and wash your feet and recline beneath the tree. I will fetch a morsel of bread and that you may sustain yourselves." Remember, by the way, this passage, and remember what Maimonides is going to make of this passage, because tomorrow we are going to see how the Kabbalists flip everything on its head in a way that one cannot even imagine, no matter what you are smoking. Okay, so this is the biblical, this is what the Bible says, right? Let's see what Maimonides says, okay? You know what, before Maimonides, it's pretty clear cut, right? We have three men. Later on, the Bible is going to make it clear that they are malachim, they are angels. When they first come, it says anashim, people. So the Bible is sort of being fair, assuming Abraham just sees people, but later we know that they are angels, they are malachim. He understands they are angels. Three people come, and you know, there's hospitality and so on and so forth. What does Maimonides have to say about this? Who would like to read?
I can read.
Yes.
I do not need to explain what a dream is. As for a vision, as in, I do make myself known to him in a vision, it is that which is called a vision of prophecy. It is a fearful, terrifying state, which comes to a prophet when he is awake. In such a state as this, the senses too cease to function, and the overflowing question comes to the rational faculty and overflows from it to the imaginative faculty, so that the latter becomes perfect and performs its function. Prophetic revelation begins sometimes with a vision of prophecy. Thereupon, the terror and the strong affections consequent upon the perfection of the action of the imaginative faculty become intensified, and then prophetic revelation comes, as is recounted of Abraham. For with regard to the beginning of that prophetic revelation, it is said, "The word of the Lord came unto Abram in a vision." And with regard to its termination, "And a deep sleep fell upon Abram," and so on. After that, "And he said unto Abram," and so on. Know again that in the case of everyone about whom exists a scriptural text that an angel talked to him or that speech came to him from God, this did not occur in any other way than in a dream or in a vision of prophecy.
Right, that's like dropping a bomb. This is the kind of passage that you can read and understand why this book was banned. What is Maimonides saying here?
He's changing the definition of the relation with the divine.
So according to this passage, what happened there? Did Abraham actually meet three people?
No.
Like in the material realm, not really, but in a dream or in kind of trance state.
Right, it's changing. This is wild. Like this has never been done before. This is right. You're a rabbi of a community, and Maimonides was a rabbi of a community, and everyone has no doubt, including the Talmud, that three men appeared to Abraham and Sarah, and they had a purpose. They had a reason, and then these three people went somewhere else. And Maimonides says, no, that actually didn't happen. It doesn't make sense. Right. So what is a prophecy to Maimonides?
Like a divine vision.
Right.
It's like a mystical experience.
Okay. What is happening in this mystical experience? Because remember that the God we spoke about a moment ago was a very scientific called God. So who is the prophet connecting to? What is happening? What is prophecy? So I'm not seeing angels. Abraham didn't see angels, but where did his mind go? What was he receiving?
It seems to me like if something like Jung's concept of collective unconscious, like the database of all the knowledge in kind of world of ideas or something like that.
Okay, that I think that's you're in a moment going to see how almost spot on you are. Elaborate just to sort of be fair. What do you mean when you say that?
That he kind of got to these altered states of consciousness where he kind of could see the reality in a more precise way, as it is allowed to many people or the normal people without this experience.
Could a non-Jew get to this?
According to this text,
According to Maimonides, what do you guys? What do you think? What are your thoughts?
I would say yes.
Okay, interesting. Any other thoughts about this? About prophecy?
Yeah. I don't know. When I read this, I feel like, once again, when we're talking about the Bible, it's more like storytelling, and there is, and what I feel here is that it's more like it goes to the idea that there's storytelling, but that's not really what happened, but more like we needed to tell you these stories so you can understand the bigger pictures, but now he's like referring to that bigger picture without the story.
Exactly. It's like exactly. The Bible needs to use mythological language because that's a language that people understand. But then Maimonides is saying, but don't fall for the trap. Don't take it a step forward. Just keep it where it is. Keep it. It's a parable. It's an allegory, and that's it. Exactly. He's killing the myth. He's killing the story. You know, in a sense. You know, one could say it's the opposite. He's saying he's saving the story, right? He's because he's afraid that people aren't getting the point. But no doubt, this is, if we read the guide for the perplexed, this is the language. And it's explanatory, and it's very philosophical. It's, you know, it's something that Aristotle would have perhaps, you know, more of a field trip to read the guide as opposed to perhaps a rabbi from the Talmud. But no doubt that definitely that's part of what's going on here. And again, so you're saying, so Michael, you were saying something interesting about how the prophet is connecting to some kind of there's like this general sort of knowledge, right? Great stuff that's somewhere, right? It's sort of maybe perhaps a Kantian, you know, something beyond the thing, something, and but then what? What do I need to do to become a prophet? Right? Well, so this is still the gap. Like, and this is where I asked, you know, what's the difference between a Jew and a non-Jew? Let's have another question in the back of our minds, which we'll touch upon in a moment. Is there a chosen people according to Maimonides? Right? Sort of, because think about it. Maimonides is referring to the Bible and to the Talmud. When he talks about the law, he means the Bible and the Talmud. He's not, sure, he's referring to philosophers, but that's because they've created a problem we need to understand. But he is not forgetting that he's giving the most sacred room and place for the Bible. So what is the Bible? What's its purpose? What then is this revolution that's created in this book? And what does it do to the Jewish people? So let's now try and move on to understand what it means to be Jewish, right? The million-dollar question. What is Maimonides going to tell us? Who would like to read? Anyone? Anyone who hasn't read yet?
Yeah, I can read.
Yes, please.
Man does not sit and move and occupy himself when he is alone in his house, as he sits, moves, and occupies himself when he is in the presence of a great king. Nor does he speak and rejoice while he is with his family and relatives, as he speaks in the king's council. Therefore, he who chooses to achieve human perfection and to be in true reality of a man of God must give his heed and know that the great king who always accompanies him and cleaves to him is greater than any human individual, even if the latter be David or Solomon. The king who cleaves to him and accompanies him is the intellect that overflows towards us. As it says, "In thy light do we see light." so does he, by means of this self-same light, examine us. And because of it, he, may he be exalted, is constantly with us, examining from on high. Can any hide himself in secret places that I shall not see him? Understand this well. Know that when perfect men understand this, they achieve such humility, such awe and fear of God, such reverence and such shame before him. May he be exalted, and this in ways that pertain to be true, reality, not imagination.
Right, so Maimonides is before we talk about this passage and move on to the last one, right, the sort of this bottom line is, after you understand the guide, if you really understand it, you're going to understand that reality is actually imagination, where everything is actually not the way we think it is completely the opposite. Let's now just keep on to the last one, and then we're going to talk about the first paragraph, second paragraph, because there are a lot of things going on here. So last paragraph, please. Thank you, Nicole.
This purpose to which I have drawn your attention is the purpose of all the actions prescribed by the law. For it is by all the particulars of the action and through their repetition that some excellent men obtain such training that they achieve human perfection.
Okay, so we have here now more of an understanding of who our God is, perhaps a hint at how one becomes a prophet, and what are the purposes of the commandments. So who is God? Who comes to a prophet? Who comes to an excellent person? What's going on in this paragraph? What are we being told?
It says that is the intellect that overflows towards us. So does he, by means of this self-same light, examine us. So it's kind of getting back to that idea somebody was saying of the collective unconscious, or it's our own intellect, kind of almost a reflection, getting to know ourselves better, maybe.
Exactly. That's wild. What is he saying? He's saying that God has never been closer to each and every one of us. God is the peak of where we don't need to go to the heavens to find the guy with the beard or the girl with the, it's in our intellect. Now, there's a nuance here. It's sort of, make no mistake, Maimonides believes there is a God. It's not that God is not separate from man, but yes, it's this meeting with the intellect. It's again, let's think again about the Greek philosophers. What is their project? What is Aristotle's project? What is Plato's project? They are obsessed not only with understanding the world and understanding creation, if there was, but it's how we can be the best people we can be. That is the source of inspiration for Maimonides, right? That there is no coaching in the Bible in that sense. There's keep commandments. This is what God told you, the chosen people, to be doing, and there are reasons for it. And the Talmud then talks about how to do it. Maimonides, this revolution is all of a sudden how to be, it's a whole new project. It's how to be the perfect person. It's almost as if I could take away the word Jewish, the Jewish just sort of happens to be there. Or does it? Right? This is, again, one of the key questions. But yes, you're spot on, Alison. This goes back to what you said, Michael, before. This is this intellect. This God, the mover, the stone, what pushes the stone, that pushes the tendons, that, you know, is this amorphic something. It's not our mind, but it's something we can only get to through our mind. If we go back to then Abraham, what did Abraham see? So Abraham, right, has studied everything that you could possibly study. He's done his science. Once we have our science, right, I'll just give you in brackets how one achieves prophecy according to Maimonides, because I didn't bring the passage. It's a very famous passage. Ultimately, according to Maimonides, right, when we read the book of Ezekiel or Jeremiah or even Moses, all you need to be in the Bible to be a prophet is to be ultimately a shepherd, right? You have to be a good person who's been with some, herded some sheep. You need to be a good person and God chooses you. Maimonides says no. You need to have gone to college. You need to have gone to an Ivy League school. You need to have read all of science. Only once you have finished, there's also an order. Only once you have finished biology, chemistry, physics, then you move on to metaphysics. Once you have studied metaphysics and you have everything inside you, then you need one more thing. You need to be the best person you can be. You need to be clean. You need to be humble. A person who knows everything that man can acquire, a person who is as humble as and good as they can be, they are the only people who have hope if they have this sort of charismatic thing within them. It's this sort of unique term Maimonides talks about, can then suddenly, through some sort of practice, reach prophecy. Okay, so it's for a very select few, and essentially this intellect is when you have all the worldly knowledge and you're a great person, then through a lot of hoping and praying, so to speak, you can exit your own mind, you can meet or cleave with this intellect, this thing, whatever that is, and then you will see reality for what it is and not what in fact is a lie. No one says this before Maimonides. Again, this is one of the reasons why people have problems with this book. It's a very foreign, right? You're taking the philosophical idea, the Western idea, the Greek idea of being, what is being a good person according to the Bible? Keeping commandments. Maimonides now has other prerequisites and says, if you follow my prerequisites, get this, you can even be better than David or Solomon. Solomon, the person of the Bible, says there's no one smarter than Solomon. Maimonides says, actually, you can be smarter than Solomon. Was Maimonides actually talking about himself? Right? If this book is a guide to achieve a certain level, should we assume that Maimonides believed he reached this level? Right? He's writing it for a student. Think about it. He's writing it for a student. Is he just sort of, and this is, again, this is one of the questions that academia has about Maimonides, is this just sort of like a hypothetical guide, or is this, no, someone who reached this sort of ecstatic something, and then he's sort of coming and saying, look, I did this. I'm the perfect man. Now let me show you who are worthy how to get to this, right? This is elitist. It's a different project. Any thoughts on this?
I think it's interesting to see, he's talking about, he brings in God's idea that they're always with us. And I think it's interesting that I obviously don't know the book as well as you, and I didn't get all of what you said from this text. But what I did understand was that if you change how you act depending on who you're with and depending on the authority that you give them. But if you act that you're always in the presence of God, then you will understand what it means to believe in God and to be religious, and therefore have access to being a prophet. And then there's obviously all of the other stuff about education and stuff.
Okay, so where we need to be, so I think you're right. I think part of the problem, and again, it's bringing certain passages, is notice at the bottom, this is the third part of the guide, chapter 52. This is towards the end of the book. This is after lengthy discussions at how one achieves and reaches God's presence. And now the assumption is, we're talking as if you can get there, then, once you've done these other prerequisites. Again, I'm following the introduction, right? In the introduction where he said, those who are vulgar, or those who haven't studied, beyond sciences or just read the Bible, it's not going to be enough.
I think another way to look at it, and this could just be like my own biases and reading into it how I want to read into it, is that you can look at it and see that if people don't have access to the stuff, like if they genuinely are so far removed from other civilization, you can still become a prophet by acting like God is always with you and studying everything that you have access to. So by repeating those actions, by practicing learning about everything that they have access to, and filling the prerequisite in the first paragraph, then you can still become a prophet despite being less knowledgeable than someone else.
Wow. So I think what you're saying is very interesting. It's especially interesting in light of, so before Maimonides, there was Philo of Alexandria, living in the 2nd century. And Philo talks to us, he's also in Egypt, and Philo talks about a group of people who seclude themselves to reach ecstatic, the sort of ecstatic to cleave with God. And Maimonides mentions this. So it's very interesting that you read it this way because, and this is part of the beauty of Maimonides, yes, you could read it this way as well. It's a fascinating interpretation. It's sort of looking and kind of like, could it be that even though he's saying you need to read everything, is there a part of Maimonides that's saying, but you know what? If you go to a cave for 20 years, you might not have to read anything. I don't know, but it's fascinating interpretation. Great, really great. Anyone else?
I have a question. I wanted to
Yes.
ask if he is basically saying that this should be the ultimate guide of the virtuous Jewish person to live, or is it like that the goal of being Jewish is to become a prophet? So he's kind of like wanting everybody to be mystic, or I don't know.
That's an interesting question. So what does it say at the bottom, right? What's the second paragraph say? The second paragraph gives you the answer. For Maimonides, the purpose of the commandments, right, is how we can perfect ourselves, right? So in that sense, and this then begs the question, so what about a non-Jew? Meaning, why is there really a chosen people, right? What happened at Mount Sinai? Now, in a different part of the guide, I didn't bring this, Maimonides discusses the idea of the chosen people. But now, it must be said, Maimonides does not discuss this very often. And it could be because it's a sensitive question. Maybe it's a question he doesn't want to answer. But when he does talk about this, he makes it very clear that the reason the Jewish people were chosen was because of the forefathers. Meaning, it's like Abraham is the sort of first perfect human being who discovers God, and then his son and his son. So as a result, there's this kind of brilliant teaching that passes down generation to generation, and that kind of then becomes a people at Mount Sinai, which is this symbolic thing, right? This sort of mass prophecy thanks to these forefathers. But yeah, one could argue, so if the commandments are meant to make us perfect, I agree with you, Michael. I think that the guide, if it says what is the sort of peak of being Jewish, it's being a prophet, hands down. Interestingly, we will see tomorrow with the Kabbalists, the peak is how to create a golem. It's something else. It's sort of, because what does it mean? The peak for a Kabbalist is to become like God. If I can create like God, I've reached the peak of humanity, right? It's an outrageous idea. Just a little bit of a teaser for tomorrow. But for Maimonides, the philosopher, the person who wants to reach the most amount of knowledge possible and to be the best person, it's to be a prophet. That's the goal. And if this is the goal, right? So then what happens to someone who's not a Jew? One could argue, according to Maimonides, you can get there as well, because there's this collective, there's this God. Perhaps Aristotle reached it as well, right? The purpose of the commandments, what we're reading here, is kind of, and passages I didn't bring, is it's a smart system, if you like. Maimonides' interpretation is that the commandments are a smart system that enable us to achieve human perfection. But make no mistake, not everyone can achieve it. Now I'm going to add one more thing which I didn't bring, and it might shed a little bit of light on this, and that is divine providence. There are two key questions or key things that separate between mysticism and philosophy. One is there evil in the world, right? If you're a philosopher, there is no evil. It's because people do stupid things or people are nasty, and because we have free will. Whereas a mystic will say, no, there is actually an evil entity in the world. And the second one is divine providence. Is God watching out over the world? So this God of Maimonides, right? In certain sections of the guide, Maimonides will clearly say, God is not interested in the particulars, because God doesn't look at the particulars, because it's a more amorphic thing. God only watches out over the most brilliant. And the only possible way to understand it, perhaps, read the guide and come back and say, no, I don't agree, but perhaps the only way to understand what Maimonides means when he says that God, there is divine providence for particulars only for the most perfect, is that once you reach that intellect that we read before, then you're cleaving with God. God is watching out over you because you're with God. You're almost like one outside of yourself. And again, this is a revolution. This is 180 degrees to the irrational and rational God in the Talmud, and for sure the God that appears. And right, you read the guide, and God is something else. A prophet is something else. The purpose of being Jewish is something else. It becomes almost more universal.
I have a question.
Yep.
So I agree with you when he made it physical, like towards science, then it's not about faith. So because it's not about faith anymore, it's accessible to every single person that doesn't believe in these particular tales. Because then you can say, okay, these tales are Jewish, they're for Jewish people, so I don't believe in that, so this doesn't apply to me. But then I'm having hard time understanding why there is like a different path of like being mystical and a philosopher. Why a philosopher would think that there is no evil, and for the mystical, if you say that the goal is to be God, then that's not abomination of like us thinking that we can possibly be God. Like I feel like that's conflicting because there is only one God. Like we don't want a bunch of gods. I don't understand.
Okay, so the last question we're going to leave for tomorrow. It's too good of a question to address today, so we're going to have to wait for tomorrow. The first part of what you said, I just want to make a clarification. Okay, Maimonides is Jewish. Maimonides, okay, the question, the million-dollar question about the guide is, where is Maimonides' allegiance? Does he have his allegiance with the philosophers, right, with logic, or with belief, with the Bible? And here, one important distinction has to be made. And again, like I said, it's almost I'm not an expert on the guide, and it's very difficult to find. My research is more in Kabbalistic, medieval Kabbalistic manuscripts, so that's sort of, but even amongst, the reason I say this is even amongst Maimonidean experts, they're all arguing with one another. They'll all agree. So I'm going to say something now that one might argue with, but it seems to be a fair statement to make, and that is as follows. Where is Maimonides' God different from the Aristotelian God? Right? Maimonides adopts the Aristotelian idea that there was this kind of big bang, this initial something that created the world, right? The stone, the tendons, something in the beginning. He differs in one very important aspect. The question is, why did God create the world? Aristotle, a true philosopher, does not ask and cannot possibly find an answer for why. It just happened. What makes Maimonides Jewish is he says, Zahaya Ratzon Ha'el. It was God's will. And that's the game changer. Okay, brilliant question. And that's where we see it makes you wonder, can a book really be written that is solely philosophical and yet also have allegiance to the Bible, right? The sort of question in the background here, is there really such a thing as Jewish philosophy? Or is that an oxymoron? Is it a contradiction in terms? Because a true philosopher has to stop perhaps where Aristotle stops and says it just kind of happened. I can logically reach that. I can't possibly reach the idea of there being a will. I might be able to use it with an axiom. With a system of axioms, I might be able to, but that's something else. Because with axioms, we can already, there are a lot of things that can be done with axioms that are sort of beyond pure philosophy. It's more a logical system, but that overrides it at times. Regarding the second thing that you mentioned, could you elaborate a little bit more, right? So I hope now you understand the difference between Aristotle's God and May, are you with us?
Yeah,
Yeah.
I have another question. So he referred to angels and
Right, no, so about evil. So, okay, so that hasn't changed. Okay. Okay, so another philosophical problem is, okay, so why don't angels exist according to Maimonides? Because it isn't possible, it doesn't logically make sense to have a sort of spiritual body which lives somewhere in the upper spheres, right? According to philosophers, there are spiritual entities beyond this world, but they can only stay in that world. They are more perfect than us because they are more fine than us, fine in the literal sense, right? There's fire and there's water, right? The elements there are less elements of them. They are finer than us, but they can't be here. The philosophical problem with bringing down an angel is that an angel belongs in the realm of the fine, in the sort of beyond this physical world. As we'll discuss tomorrow, Kabbalists have solutions for this. There is a possibility of cloaking a fine being, an angel, with a physical garment, right? But for a philosopher, you can't. Now, in much the same way, if for Maimonides, God is this, again, let's put aside the idea of God's will, because that's the most problematic idea in Maimonidean theory, because it sort of overrides him being a philosopher. Let's just stick to God as being this intellect and the philosopher reaching divine knowledge. It's a very amorphic thing. Now, the more amorphic it becomes, the more vague it is, you're blurring the possibility of it being, it's something, but it's something I'm not really sure what it is. In much the same way, I can't really have a real evil entity, because to have a real evil entity in this world, like Satan, is like saying I have an angel in this world. And if an angel can't be here because it's a fine thing that has to stay somewhere else, then I don't have Satan either. Right? Sort of once we're playing philosophic, it's purely based on philosophical assumptions. But the idea is there are four elements, and there is this ripple effect, and I'm not going to use the word emanation because philosophers, Plato likes emanation. Emanation is more of a mystical idea, this sort of like going like this, sort of from this sort of infinite God to here we have our world. But with Maimonides and with philosophers, by and large, there is spirituality and there is physicality, and the only way that the two can come together, as we said, is this prophetic idea of once you know everything, you can sort of somehow escape your mind, and when you close your eyes, you can cleave and go somewhere else. And in that sense, I can't really have, evil is man's free will. By the way, why does man have free will? Because God is not watching over individuals. God is watching over the grand scale of things in the sense that there was this divine God that willed the world. But like I said, we come back to that saying in itself becomes problematic with talking about philosophy. It's that one point where the allegiance, am I with the philosophers, am I with God? When I talk about will, that's the kicker. So if that sort of answers your question.
I have a question.
Yes.
So there's the idea that God being with us. It seems to me that's an idea that's like very much within Christianity. So do you think there's a link there between?
Very interesting. Okay, so Philo, the philosopher that I mentioned before, who lived in the 2nd century in Alexandria, Philo is very, and we'll get back to Maimonides in a moment. Philo is very interesting because Philo is a Jew. Philo is probably even a rabbi. He writes a mass of books. Jews don't read them. For some reason, Jews don't read what Philo wrote until about the 20th century. Some read him throughout history, but don't. Now, Philo is huge. Do you know why Jews don't read Philo? Because the Christians adopt Philo. The Christians love Philo because Philo starts with this idea, which again is Philo's writing 2nd century. That's around the time of, we have already philosophy. Philo has this idea of God being logos. Logos is this kind of, this thing. It's no longer, again, it's already then, there is no God with a beard, there is logos. There is this divine logic, this divine something who we can find inside us. And in that sense, again, that's why I wouldn't say that it's a Christian idea, because Christians adopted a Philonic idea. You know, and Philo has a lot of influence on certain circles in Christian thought, on Christian Kabbalah. There is such a thing, on Christian mysticism. So in that sense, it's not really a Christian idea that God is inside us. But as we see here with Maimonides, and already there is Christianity, but that's why I'm going back to Philo, because he's our other Jewish philosopher. The idea of God within us starts possibly with Philo. But yes, you will find today those kind of similarities. And if you look at Hasidic Judaism, right? The reason the series could have been called the 5 books that change Jewish history, the reason it isn't is because there is not one Hasidic book. Hasidism is sort of the psychological revolution after Kabbalah. There isn't, unlike the Guide and unlike the Zohar, the Bible, and the Talmud, there is not a single Hasidic text that you could say is the game changer. It's a movement. But in that sense, the Hasidic revolution is bringing, I'll say, Christian ideas, but again, because they're not really Christian, because it goes back to Philo, this idea of finding God within me. Interestingly, Hasidism has both the transcendental God who is watching over me, but I also want that kind of quote-unquote inner God that is watching over me inside. So it becomes more complicated, more psychological, if that answers your question.
Yeah, it does. Thank you.
Okay. Any other questions?
Yeah. So, especially with Yom Kippur, there is like a bunch of there is like things that you ask for forgiveness for the things that you have done. So, with the definition that you said that God is not looking. That's why we have free will. God is not like looking at each single person. I always thought that that Yom Kippur was the day that I was cleaning my list from, like, it was like a list of things that I was doing. And then I was like, because someone was writing it, or like it was like kind of counted or something like that. But then
this is only Maimonides. It's only Maimonides. You don't have to follow Maimonides. It's you know it's no. So yes, you're right that according to Maimonides, what is Yom Kippur about? It's about a good time for us to work on ourselves, right? The inner coach in us saying it's a good time to say sorry to people. It's a good time, but it's about perfection. It's about ourselves. It's not really, perhaps, like I said, with Maimonides, everything's perhaps, but it's not really that there is a God who is waiting for you to say this, but it's a perfect system that can create, for those who want it, to become the sort of perfect person, which means ethical as well as intellectual, which is why I said, by the way, that Maimonides is elitist when you think about it, because, you know, there are some people who are smarter, there are some people who are less, some people born with more money, some people less. The sort of what's not fair here is that Maimonides is saying only certain people can reach perfection, right? That's not fair. It should be about, right? What's the one thing that everyone is equal in? How to be a human being, right? Everyone has sort of an evil inclination and a good inclination, and Maimonides topples this and says, no, the sort of the prerequisite is having this perfect intellect. And this is why, what then happens, and like I said, this we'll touch upon tomorrow, what creates the mystical or Kabbalistic revolution? The God of the Guide for the Perplexed becomes a God that is suddenly, he's in outer space. He's way, you know, it's suddenly there's a God who's perhaps not listening. There's a God. He willed the world, but he's not, you know, it's a lot of, suddenly there's this cry. Well, what am I praying for, right? This is exactly a question someone's going to ask after the Guide. What's the purpose of Yom Kippur? Kabbalah is going to solve this. The Zohar is going to solve this. And in history, Zohar beats the Guide for the Perplexed in Jewish history. You know, we can argue what makes most sense, but hands down, scholars agree. If you look at, you know, what it means to be Jewish today in the majority of Jews, irrational Kabbalah has beat rational philosophy in Judaism in terms of day-to-day practice in terms of, if I take the sort of, the Jewish prayer book and say what's inside it, Kabbalist 1. But again, we'll get there tomorrow. So you still have your list before Yom Kippur. It's just a question of if you follow Maimonides or someone else, but it's one revolution. It's one revolution that made a lot of people question their lists before Yom Kippur. Exactly. Any other questions?
I have a question.
Yep.
In the beginning of the talking, you said he wrote the book because the people didn't understand the Talmud, right?
No, we brought a passage from the introduction which spoke about how Maimonides was saying that people weren't understanding the Bible. They weren't also understanding the Talmudic interpretations, but essentially they weren't understanding the Bible. They weren't understanding when the Bible says God with his outstretched hand took the people out of Egypt, for example.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, no worries. Yep.
Ask in before when we first read the text that's currently showing, you talked about whether scholars debating whether like Maimonides is talking about like himself in terms of the perfect person, or like one of the things he talks about is like being humble somewhere.
Yep.
So like I achieve such humility. So like with that in mind, is it possible for like Maimonides to have like consciously written the book from a place of like, yes, I've achieved this is how you do it, because like that destroys the humility? Like either he's achieved it and he's like not aware of it, or he's like imagining what it's like but he doesn't think he's achieved it.
I think he wrote it being humble, so imagine how he was really.
Yeah, it's like, perhaps he wrote it, and then once writing it, being humble, achieved what he was after, and then. No, it's a brilliant question, because you're right. It's what is humility, right? Does humility mean that we're not aware of our strengths? Does humility not mean that we're aware of our strengths, but that we're meant to use them for a certain purpose, on the one hand? On the other hand, right, and we read this in the Bible, the idea that you're meant to be, right, like the forefathers, this idea of being humble. Like, yes, there's no doubt you're meant to be humble, and you're right. The question being, what's a person like that meant to do? Like, on the one hand, and it's obviously it's a question with no answer, but on the one hand, one could argue he was humble. He suddenly reached this prophecy, he reached it, and then he has a problem. If he doesn't write some sort of book to be able to educate others to reach this, it's not fair. It'll get lost. So what are you supposed to do about this? Right, that's the challenge. If a certain person reaches a certain pinnacle, intellectual, spiritual pinnacle, then is it not your role in society, the ethical thing to do to sort of, so I don't know, I feel like it's sort of somewhere in the gray area between awareness and humility, and perhaps a difference between the two. I don't know, but it's a great question. It really is.
I guess also it actually depends, I realized, how, like, what you define as like humble, because you could say it's perfectly humble to like to share and be like acknowledge your strengths and like things that you're good at, like as long as you don't like big them up.
So I'll add another piece of information which might help us decide what this is about. The first passage that I brought wasn't really the beginning. It was the beginning. It was the introduction. But before the introduction, there's also a little letter. And there is a letter to a specific student. And Maimonides talks about a specific student who came studying with him. And Maimonides writes, I saw that you were very eager, and I saw that you learned a lot about astrology and a lot about science and this and this and this and this and this. And the idea is this one pager, which is written to a certain Yosef, and the assumption is perhaps that there was a Yosef who came and studied with him. Maimonides, after the student departs, realizes that there is someone worthy, but you need to find the right educational methodology to pass on the information without feeding you with a spoon, but by kind of, it's what Maimonides calls chapter headings. Okay, the teaching someone by chapter headings means I'm going to give you one sentence, I'm going to give you another sentence. Now you're going to try and create that leap between the two sentences. That's called teaching through chapter headings, and that's part of what makes the guide educationally kind of perfect. It's part of one of these esoteric styles we were talking about where, it's part of scattering the knowledge. It's part of giving one bit here, one bit there. But my point to what you're saying, Noam, is that this initial letter that is written at the start, just before the introduction, perhaps was a physical letter that he wrote to someone because he's addressing a student. He's talking about how he was when he was with him, why he didn't reveal more at the time because he thought he was a bit too eager and hadn't read certain stuff, and now he feels he should write this and give it to him. It still doesn't answer the question. So the assumption is if you're writing it for a student and you're writing sentences like this, perhaps you did achieve it, and perhaps it's your ethical, moral duty to pass it on to someone else. Interesting. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, I have a question. So, when you said that you have to be ethical and intellectual to be able to be considered Jewish, you said, or
no, it's to become a prophet, which is like the pinnacle of perfection of the Maimonidean project.
I guess ethical is the Bible, the Ten Commandments, and then when you say about intellectual, what you should study? Like you should study Greek philosophy, like Maimonides. What do you mean by intellectual? What books are the ones that you have to study and able to reach that point?
So what Maimonides means is what Aristotle means. Aristotle wrote that there is an order for studying. The order is you need to first study the hard sciences, math, biology, chemistry, you need to study science. Once you understand science, and only then can you learn metaphysics, which is like the sort of, theology, theosophy, the idea of sort of understanding God and creation. In fact, Maimonides even goes so far as to say, in the Talmud, there is a discussion in the Talmud about certain esoteric knowledge. And there are two types of esoteric knowledge that you can only study in specific conditions. One is called Masa Bereshit, the act of creation, and one is called Masa Merkava, the act of the chariot. Masa Bereshit is Genesis, is the beginning, right? Which is very difficult to understand, and it's the secrets hidden within the act of creation. The second type of esoteric studies is the act of the chariot. It is the vision that Ezekiel saw. It is seeing God. Maimonides takes the Talmudic idea of act of creation and act of, God, or act of the chariot, and says, this is what Aristotle's talking about. The Talmudic act of creation is actually studying science, and the Talmudic act of chariot is actually studying metaphysics, and that is the order you need to go about. So he's giving a new interpretation to what the rabbis in the Talmud meant when they were talking about esoteric texts. He's giving it a philosophical turn based on how Aristotle wants children to go to school in Greece. Okay, so there is a methodology. It's first science and then metaphysics, then understanding God and higher lofty ideas.
So, but with science, it is objective, right? But in metaphysics, are we talking about which specific philosophy or?
So great question. By the time Maimonides is alive, he means actually reading the metaphysical books that Aristotle wrote, but it also means metaphysical contemplation, right? Sort of reading so with math, it's very simple. I study algebra, I study geometry, and I know what a triangle is, I know what a circle is, and this will give me information to understand how King Solomon built a perfect circular pool, right? They go hand in hand. I need geometry to understand what King Solomon did. And then I need to read Aristotle's books on metaphysics to then go back to the metaphysical parts in the Bible and understand what's going on. So it's part of it is reading actual books that were written in Greece, and part of it then is metaphysical contemplation. But you are not allowed, according to Maimonides, to begin with metaphysical contemplation before you have finished your math, science, so on and so forth.
We see kind of the same concept with Kabbalah, that you have to study all the Bible and Talmud and able to read for Kabbalah.
So it's similar, but not quite, because in Kabbalah, and we'll get to this tomorrow, in Kabbalah, there's no idea of having to study science before Kabbalah. There were certain Kabbalists that was the case. There were certain Kabbalists that took Maimonides, took the Guide for the Perplexed, and turned it into Kabbalah. Okay, but that's very few. The idea of not studying before you're 40 or not studying Kabbalah before you're married is because it's a kind of there's a polemic around Kabbalah. We'll touch upon it tomorrow, but it's partly it's a separate story. In truth, I think it's a separate story. Part of it's what this is about, but it's by and large separate. Any other questions?
Yes, I would like to ask. So what was his worry? Why first we should study science and then metaphysics? Did he argument somehow or no?
Yes, of course. So his argument is again based on the Aristotelian argument, and the Aristotelian, I think it's the book of Nicomacheus. The essential argument, and it goes into you can't understand things like the four elements and things like creation, right? This idea of a spiritual matter. You can't understand matter without understanding physics or biology or chemistry. They're all intertwined. That's the essential argument. And it's a logical one. It makes sense. You know, also remember that in today's mindset, we know a little bit about a lot. That's our biggest problem today. We all know a little bit about a lot. Back then, you had a book. You were lucky if someone gave you a book, and you studied that book, and you went somewhere to someone else's book, and you copied their book. And, you know, so today, put your mind in a kind of not even medieval, in a prehistoric sort of 2,000 years ago mindset. You're on a Greek island. Form and matter mean nothing to you before you've been in the class about, you know, first algebra and you know what they're actually, the way the school system worked in ancient Greece. That's the point. So it's okay. It's different today because we have basic understanding of stuff. It's the biggest problem we have today. Any other questions? Okay.
Why do you think it's a problem to have little knowledge of a lot of things?
Because it creates a lot of fake news. It, you know, it's, you know what, I'll retract. I think knowing a little bit about a lot today, like if I look at my kids, I have 3 little kids, you know, they're rat bags. My boy Uri is 4 years old. He knows more than I ever knew at the age of 4, hands down, right? Because I don't know, it's just the way, whether it's YouTube or it's other stuff or Wikipedia, I don't even know what it is. But there's also a problem in that if you're getting too much knowledge about a lot of stuff without a systematic way, a sort of ladder in which we're ascending to understand stuff, then you're also missing out on something. You know, like I think it's true for any text. You know, to take the Guide for the Perplexed. Any one of you now, if you take the Guide for the Perplexed and you have not studied, you know, introduction classes to Greek philosophy, you'll understand a bit, and you'll end up thinking you know something about the book, but in truth, without intros to Greek philosophy, to Islamic philosophy, to knowing the Bible, having read the Talmud, right? There's suddenly a lot of books you have to have read before looking at the guide. The problem today, what I meant is today we can go into Wikipedia and we can read what Wikipedia has to say about the guide, and it's good to do that. But one could argue, is it really worth anything? So I know, so I know something about it, right? And in that sense, our discussions here, hopefully, right? The hopeful goal of these discussions isn't it's meant to make us ask more questions, each and every one of us, myself included. But more than anything, it's meant to make each and every one of us, hopefully, go back to one of these other books and look at the book, right? If any one of us after this session opens a Talmud, opens a Bible, opens the guide, opens Zohar, chooses any paragraph and tries to understand it beyond what is said in Wikipedia in general, you're miles ahead of anyone else. That's the point, right? That's in that sense. I mean, you know, it's tempting today to go and part of the problem with the culture of knowing a bit about everything is a lot of it. When you think of how many Wikipedia pages are wrong, you know, like you know, the Kabbalist that I'm writing my PhD on has a Wikipedia page. There are so many problems there. It pisses me off. I don't even know who created the page. But someone, you know, the way the way knowledge works today is it's what's more important is that anyone can do what they want unless the idea of knowledge. You know, there are great things about that, but there are also, you know, the sort of downsides to it. You know,
and also the idea that you should be a well-grounded, known like person, like liberal arts. You should have to like have an idea of like what's going on, and then that makes you a more I don't know if intelligent, but like a more what's the word?
Like a well-rounded education. But again,
yeah.
that's part of what, you know, Aristotle was talking about. And in fact, there was one thing that Aristotle was missing, and we'll end it with this, was his only problem, Aristotle, is that he did not have Australian rules football, the greatest game to have ever been invented by man. There are some things that are more important than, you know, books are important, but, you know, everything has to be put in proportion, you know. So I hope you've enjoyed. I know I've learned a lot. Comments we're making make me want to reread these passages. And like I said, find the texts, open them up. A lot of them are very easily accessible. Tomorrow, hopefully you'll join, because what we read about Maimonides today and like the angels and Abraham, it's going to get wild, like really, really wild. So thanks a lot, and we'll see you tomorrow.
See you tomorrow.
Bye.
Thanks.